Behind a pane of glass in a small museum in Philadelphia, there is a scrap of cotton pillowcase, stiff and brown, where a dying man's blood soaked into it more than 160 years ago. A few hundred miles away, in a military medical collection in Washington, sit fragments of a shattered skull, cataloged and boxed. Somewhere in an archive are the blood-stiffened cuffs of the army surgeon who worked over him in a theater box. There are locks of coarse, dark hair, snipped by grieving hands and passed down through families. And in Chicago, there is a cloak, displayed for generations as if it carried the same blood as all the rest. Every one of those objects is real. Every one of them may contain the genetic code of Abraham Lincoln. And here is the strange part, the part that almost no one says out loud. Nearly everything we claim to know about what was happening inside Lincoln's body comes from looking at him, from photographs and life masks and the memories of people who once stood near him. It has almost never come from reading his genes. For decades, geneticists have believed that a single test could settle a mystery that has followed Lincoln since before his death. Some of them fought for years to run it. One of the most respected geneticists of his century personally sought access to pieces of Lincoln's skull, and when they finally got close, the thing that stopped them was not a locked door and not a government secret. It was something far stranger and far more human than that. Now, let's talk about what the record actually shows. The mystery begins with the body itself, but it becomes a scientific question only in the early 1990s. That is when researchers finally pinned down the gene behind Marfan syndrome, a disorder of the body's connective tissue. Marfan syndrome had been described as far back as 1896, named for a French pediatrician, Antoine Marfan. But for most of the 20th century, it could only be recognized by its outward signs, never confirmed at the level of the gene. Then, around 1991, that changed. And the moment it changed, a possibility opened that had never existed before. For the first time, you could imagine testing a dead man's tissue and asking, in the language of molecules, whether he carried the mutation. So, in 1991, the National Museum of Health and Medicine convened a committee. It was chaired by Victor McCusick, one of the founders of modern medical genetics, a man who would later help tie Marfan's scattered signs, in the heart and the skeleton alike, back to a single defective gene. The panel brought together geneticists, lawyers, forensic scientists, historians, and even a representative of the National Marfan Foundation. Their job was not to run the test. Their job was to decide whether the test should ever be run at all. The questions they faced were heavier than anyone expected. Lincoln left no descendants in a direct line. He could not consent, and he had been dead for more than 120 years. A congressman from Illinois insisted the panel first determine whether Lincoln himself would have approved. That proved almost impossible to settle. Lincoln had died before anyone even knew DNA existed, and he had left no word anywhere about how he might feel about medical testing after his death. In the end, they concluded he probably would have agreed if the result could help others, because everything about the man suggested deep empathy. So they gave what one account called a qualified green light. Testing a small fragment of tissue, they decided, was permissible. The debate that led there was more human than you might expect. On one side stood people who argued that Lincoln, as a national figure, could become a kind of beacon. One person living with Marfan syndrome addressed the panel directly, saying the possibility that Lincoln had shared the condition proved that people like them could still contribute something of lasting value, that the syndrome was not shameful, only inconvenient. On the other side stood those who pointed to how fiercely private Lincoln had been in life, and argued that running medical tests on him without his consent was an invasion of that privacy, a door that once opened might never close again. And hanging over all of it was a blunt,
physical fact. Any test would mean pulping a small piece of a priceless object, and even then, the scientists might walk away with no solid answer at all. But they attached a condition that would quietly doom the whole effort. Test, they advised, only after science had first defined exactly which mutation to hunt for. And here was the trap. As they deliberated, researchers kept discovering more genes that could produce a Marfan-like body. The single clear target they needed had multiplied into many. Everyone had assumed the science would be the easy part. They were wrong about that. And to understand why, you have to start where the whole idea started, with a body that seemed to announce its own diagnosis.
Begin with what anyone could see. Lincoln stood 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when that made him a giant. He was lean to the point of gauntness. His arms and legs were long, his fingers long and tapering, his hands and feet famously enormous. His face was long and deeply lined. Observers who met him reached again and again for the same words: tall, lank, spidery. Some who studied him later would point to subtler marks too: an unusually shaped chest, an arm span that ran longer than he stood tall. There was even a peculiar detail that doctors would eventually attach his name to: a slight bobbing of the foot in time with the pulse, something now sometimes called the Lincoln sign. To a modern eye trained on Marfan syndrome, that silhouette reads like a page from a textbook. And here is why the appearance matters so much, because Marfan is, at its root, a failure of the body's scaffolding. The instructions for that scaffolding live in a gene called fibrillin 1 on chromosome 15. That gene tells the body how to build a protein called fibrillin. Think of connective tissue as the rigging of a ship, the tensioned cables that hold everything in place and let it flex without snapping. Fibrillin is the fine, elastic thread woven through those cables. Molecules of it link together into long structures that scientists describe as beads on a string, and those structures reinforce the walls of the aorta, the ligaments that suspend the lens of the eye, and the framework of the skeleton itself. When one copy of that gene is faulty, and it takes only one, the thread is weak throughout the body. The cables stretch, the bones grow long, the great vessel of the heart can thin and swell. A single flawed instruction, written once, echoes through every part of a person at once, and that carries a consequence most people never consider. In many with the condition, the weakened aorta can grow threadbare and rupture, and they die young. So, if the theory were true, it would quietly rewrite history. Lincoln was 56 when he was assassinated. A man with that mutation might never have survived a second term regardless of what happened at Ford's Theater. The bullet, in that grim version of events, only reached him first. That is what the record shows on the surface. A man built exactly as the theory would predict, and stakes that reach all the way into how we understand his presidency. But a silhouette is not a diagnosis, and the next problem is far thornier, because it turns out this whole idea did not begin with Lincoln at all. The most revealing part of the story is where the diagnosis actually came from, and it is not where you would guess. It did not begin with a doctor examining Lincoln. It began in 1959 with a doctor examining a child. A physician was treating a young boy whose long, spidery fingers pointed toward Marfan syndrome. Curious, he traced the boy's family line backward, generation by generation, until it reached a man named Mordecai Lincoln, the president's great-great-grandfather. The boy, in other words, was a distant cousin of Abraham Lincoln. And from that thin thread, a diagnosis for the president himself was spun. In 1962, the idea reached print, and it never really left. On the surface, that reasoning sounds compelling because Marfan syndrome is what geneticists call autosomal dominant. That is the same inheritance pattern behind the fibrillin gene I described a moment ago, where a single faulty copy is enough to cause the condition. Autosomal dominant traits tend to run visibly through families, surfacing generation after generation. So if a descendant of the Lincoln line carried Marfan, it was tempting to conclude the mutation ran in the family and that Abraham sat somewhere on the same branch. But look closer and the logic falls apart. That boy had a great many ancestors, and Mordecai Lincoln was only one of them. The mutation could have entered his bloodline from any direction, from any of dozens of family lines that had nothing to do with the president. Sharing one distant grandfather with Lincoln proves nothing about what Lincoln himself carried. The genealogy was suggestive. What the record could not call it was evidence, so appearance alone could not settle it, and the family tree could not settle it. Two of the three pillars holding up the Marfan theory turn out to be built of guesswork, which is exactly the moment when DNA was supposed to ride in and rescue the whole question. That is where the third pillar was meant to stand, and that is where everything breaks. This is where the story should have ended cleanly with a test and an answer. And before we go further, it is worth giving the Marfan theory its strongest case because there is a real one. Look at the photographs. Look at the life masks taken of Lincoln's face and hands while he was still alive. Study the proportions, the height, the astonishing reach of those hands. Surely, you might think, a body that specific is proof enough on its own. It is a fair challenge, and it deserves a real answer. The answer is that appearance is a liar in this particular courtroom. The same tall, long-limbed Marfanoid build can be produced by more than one disorder because more than one genetic fault can throw off the way the body grows its connective tissue. Later researchers would argue that Lincoln's features fit at least one other rare genetic syndrome just as well, a hereditary cancer syndrome called multiple endocrine neoplasia type 2B. Two entirely different genetic stories written in two different places in the genome can cast the very same long-limbed shadow. One silhouette. Appearance can raise the question, it cannot answer it. Only the molecules can. And this is where the molecules fail us, because of the second hard truth at the center of this whole story. DNA does not last forever. From the moment a person dies, their DNA begins to break apart, shattering into shorter and shorter fragments. And every hand that touches a relic, every fiber that brushes against it across the decades, leaves behind foreign genetic material of its own. Think of it like a letter left out in the rain for 160 years. The words were written clearly once, but the ink has run, the paper has torn, whole lines have dissolved into stains, and dozens of other people have handled the page and pressed their own smudges across it. You might make out a word here, a phrase there, but you cannot read the letter, and worse, you cannot even prove whose letter it was. That last problem haunts these relics. The cape long displayed as Lincoln's, McCusick himself suspected, may be a fake. The cloak in Chicago may be soaked not with Lincoln's blood, but with the blood of Major Henry Reed Rathbone, the officer wounded while trying to stop the assassination. You cannot diagnose a man from blood you cannot prove is his. What the record cannot do, in case after case, is even confirm whose stain it is looking at. So, the science that was supposed to be the easy part turned out to be the hardest part of all. And then, decades later, someone decided to force the question anyway. The most surprising turn in this story is not that no one ever tested him. It is what happened when someone finally insisted. The year was 2009, the 200th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, and a cardiologist named John Sotos stepped forward with a bold claim. Sotos, who had served as a medical consultant for the television drama house and had written a book on Lincoln's health, argued that the old Marfan theory was simply wrong. He believed Lincoln had that other condition, the hereditary cancer syndrome, and he suspected the president was quietly dying of its complications even before the bullet ever reached him. He went further still, arguing the same condition could be traced through Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks. He described a disorder so total that it shaped Lincoln from skull to feet, a body, in his telling, as rare as the mind it carried. To prove any of it, Sotos wanted to test the blood on that framed pillowcase in Philadelphia, a fragment donated generations earlier by a man on the Surgeon General's staff who had helped tend the president in his final hours. The museum that holds it, a Grand Army of the Republic Museum and Library, took the request seriously enough to bring it before its board, and the board said no. Its president explained that too many questions remained about how the fragile artifact would be handled and protected. Testing it would mean sacrificing a piece of it, grinding an irreplaceable relic into raw material for a laboratory, with no guarantee of an answer waiting at the end. That refusal was not a cover-up. It was a museum protecting the one physical thing it could never replace. And when other researchers did manage to examine items said to hold Lincoln's DNA in the years that followed, the results only proved the point. Very little usable DNA turned up. What did turn up could not be reliably tied to Lincoln at all, and it showed no clear sign of the diseases anyone was hunting for. The letter, once again, had been left out in the rain far too long. So we are left with a genuinely strange situation. The relics exist, the gene is understood, the test can be imagined in perfect detail, and still, no one has read the answer. Which raises a question we have been circling this entire time. If we have never actually read Lincoln's genes, then where on earth did our certainty come from? So if it was never confirmed, where did the confidence come from? Why do so many people speak of Lincoln's Marfan syndrome as settled fact, a line in an encyclopedia, when the test behind it was never once run to completion? The answer is a lesson in how beliefs harden. The Marfan idea was born, remember, in 1959 and put into print in 1962, in an age before anyone could read the fibrillin gene at all. It was a retro-diagnosis, a verdict reached by looking backward at a body and a family tree, at a time when that was the only kind of verdict available. There was nothing dishonest about it. It was simply the best that era could do. But then, something happened to that modest, tentative idea. It was repeated. And repetition over decades does something quiet and powerful. A cautious hypothesis, restated often enough, slowly loses its question mark. Each retelling shed a little more of the doubt until the careful phrase, might have had Marfan syndrome, hardened into the flat assertion, had Marfan syndrome, and there was a second force at work, a cultural one. Across the second half of the 20th century, and especially as DNA fingerprinting entered courtrooms and headlines, the public absorbed a powerful new faith. The faith was that DNA answers everything, that a single stain, a single strand, a single test can deliver truth on demand. It was the quiet assumption that a bloodstain simply equals an answer, the way a fingerprint equals a name. That faith made the Lincoln question feel already solved, as if the test were a formality, as if the blood on that pillowcase were only waiting for someone to press a button. What the record actually shows is the opposite. The certainty came first, and the evidence was expected to catch up later. The famous fact that Lincoln had Marfan syndrome was never a finding. It was a story, assembled from a striking body, one distant cousin, and an optimism about a test that was never able to deliver. Which leaves one last possibility, the strangest of them all, and the one almost no one wants to say plainly. Here it is. The answer almost certainly exists. It is not lost to history the way a burned library is lost. It is written right now in a specific gene on chromosome 15 in tissue that we physically possess and keep under glass and lock and catalog number. We are not missing the answer. We are simply unable to read it. Sit for a moment with how unusual that is. The blood is real. The gene is known. The place to look is understood down to the exact chromosome. And still the answer stays out of reach, held there by two forces at once. On one side, a molecule too broken and too contaminated to speak clearly after 160 years. On the other, a set of relics too precious and too uncertain in their very origins to destroy on the chance that they might finally talk. This is the wall that every attempt has run into, and it is worth naming honestly because it is not the wall people imagine. There is no vault. There is no order from on high to bury the truth. There is only decay and doubt and the refusal to grind a nation's relics into dust for a maybe. And there is something almost universal in that. It is the same wall we all reach at the edge of the people we have lost. The body may outlast the person, the relic may outlast the life, but the story stops being something we can check. At some point the dead keep their own counsel, and no test we build can compel them to answer. Lincoln, so studied, so photographed, so measured that we know the bob of his foot and the span of his hands, still holds this one thing back. The letter is right there in front of us. We simply cannot read it. And maybe that changes what this whole search was ever really about. So let me state it plainly. The Lincoln DNA mystery is not a locked door with a guard standing in front of it. It is an honest collision between three stubborn things: a fragile relic, a decayed molecule, and a diagnosis that kept slipping out of reach, even as the science advanced. Every attempt to force an answer has broken against one of those three, and often against all three at once. And here is the part that has to be said, because leaving it out would be its own kind of dishonesty. None of this means the theory is wrong. Lincoln's body really did carry the marks that first raised the question. The Marfan idea is a serious one, and the rival theory that hereditary cancer syndrome is serious too. It is entirely possible that Lincoln did carry a mutation on that fibrillin gene, or on a different one nearby, and that some future method, gentler and more powerful than anything we have now, will one day read what today's tools cannot. The door is not sealed forever, it is only shut for now, and even without a verdict, the long argument was never wasted. Decade after decade, the simple act of asking whether Lincoln carried the condition kept pulling a little understood disorder into the light, and reminded a great many people that a body marked by it could still belong to one of the most consequential lives the nation has ever produced. The uncertainty, in other words, is not a failure of the story. The uncertainty is the finding. We are looking directly at the exact limit of what evidence can currently tell us, and that limit is itself the most honest answer we have, which brings us back to where we started, to a scrap of stained cotton behind a pane of glass. Return, one last time, to that framed fragment of pillowcase in Philadelphia. For years, the instinct has been to look at it and imagine a secret waiting to be pried loose, something withheld, something we are owed. That instinct is the very thing this whole story quietly dissolves, because the truth is gentler and stranger than a secret. Some answers are not being kept from us. They are simply out of reach, held there by time and by the plain limits of the physical world. And in this particular case, the choice not to chase the answer, the choice not to reduce an irreplaceable relic to powder on the chance of a maybe its own kind of answer,
When Lincoln's body was moved to a more secure resting place long ago, his last surviving son asked only that his father be left in peace. There is a version of restraint that is not defeat. It is respect. We tend to believe that knowing is always better than not knowing, that every mystery is a problem to be solved and every stain a test waiting to be run. But some of what we most want to know sits behind a wall that no button will open, at least not yet, and perhaps not in our lifetimes. The blood is real. The gene is known. The answer is written where we cannot go. What we choose to do with a question like that, whether we grind toward it or leave it in peace, may say more about us than the answer ever could about him. And that choice, unlike the test, is one we still get to make.